Okay, so let's now have a look at the poem London, probably Blake's most famous poem, or one of the most famous poems, along with The Sick Rose and perhaps The Lamb and the Tiger in the songs, and Jerusalem, of course, which is not one of the songs of Innocence and Experience, which is famous for other reasons. So here's the poem. It is undoubtedly a bleak vision of London. London, of course, the greatest city in the world at that time, the largest city in the world, massively increased in terms of population and scale over recent decades because of the Industrial Revolution, the development of factories, back-to-back housing, lots of people sort of squashed in, and a huge discrepancy, a huge division between the rich and the poor. And Blake, as we know from accounts of him at the time, used to walk a lot, really. He would walk around London and observe things. And you probably noticed how a lot of his poems do involve people sort of wandering around or walking around. And it's quite interesting that this one begins with the phrase, I wander, the subject I, the verb wander, I wander through. The persona here is an observer, whether it's Blake or some imagined persona, it doesn't matter in a way, but we have an observer who is going to take us through the streets of London, as it were. I wander through each chartered street, near where the chartered Thames does flow. And the first word that leaps out at us here, of course, is the word chartered, repeated, chartered with a number of meanings, but the two key meanings here, one is mapped, so like in a charter or a chart, so the streets are mapped, the Thames is mapped, everything is written down, everything is labelled, everything is controlled and on paper. And also charter with the idea of a legal contract, like the famous Magna Carta, suggesting that everything is owned by somebody. This is a city in which every street, every house is owned, and even the Thames itself, this image of sort of nature, really, the great mighty river flowing down towards the sea. Even the banks of the Thames and different bits of the Thames are owned and controlled by somebody. So we begin with an image of entrapment, an image of control. Mark in every face I meet, marks of weakness, marks of woe. Again, that repetition, these hammer blow repeated words that you get in this poem. Mark here being the verb to notice, then being transposed into the noun marks of weakness, marks of woe, like a sort of symbol or a visual image of sorrow. And I think it's Professor Leader, Zachary Leader, who talks about the rhythm of London, these iambic, this iambic meter, da-dum, 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 unstressed, stressed, unstressed, stressed. I wander through each charted street. He talks about how it gives the poem a sort of deadened feeling, a numb feeling. He uses the word anaesthetised, as if the person who's walking through London has just seen too much and is sort of in despair, has been sort of numbed, really, by the weight of sorrow that he sees. To a large extent, I think we can agree with that through most of the poem, but as we shall see, perhaps we might disagree with Zachary Leader when we get to the end of the poem, where it seems that stronger feelings of anger perhaps do crack through or burst through the deadened feeling, the zombie-like feeling of most of it. Okay. On to the next stanza, and again that repetition which perhaps supports Zachary Leader's view. Every cry, every man, every. It's repeated over and over again, as if to stress the ubiquity, the everywhereness of this sorrow. It is inescapable. It covers all ages, every man, every infant, every voice. And the use of the word voice here perhaps makes us notice how the poem moves from the sense of sight, from seeing things, seeing the marks of weakness, to being dominated through the rest of the poem by the sense of hearing. This is a poem of sound. It's as if the persona hears the sounds of sorrow everywhere. The chimney sweeper's cry, the hapless soldier's sigh, the cursing of the youthful harlot, the chimney sweeper reminding us of these exploited children, the epitome of child labour, the blackening church, well, blackening because of the soot and the pollution, but also there's a sense there of moral degradation. The fact that the church is allowing these things to happen is sort of tarnishing the image of the church. The soldier in the palace, the hapless soldier's sigh, runs in blood down palace walls. Perhaps what we think of there is the way that the soldiers, these working class people, their role is to protect the rich, the powerful who live in the palaces, the kings, the queens, the lords and the ladies. They are giving up their lives to protect those in positions of privilege. And we think perhaps of the French Revolution, which had happened not so very long before, and the blood running in the streets of Paris. The most shocking image comes in the final stanza, of course, but most through midnight streets I hear that connecting phrase there, but most, drawing attention to the fact that this is going to be the real the most horrifying of all the images, the midnight streets, that sense of darkness, the depth of the night. How the youthful harlot's curse blasts the newborn infant's tear and blights with plagues the marriage hearse. A harlot, of course, is a prostitute. The fact that Blake uses the adjective youthful, we need to take notice of that. This prostitute was probably very, very young, maybe 13 or something like that. This essentially is a child who is giving birth to another child, a newborn baby. And the horror of this image lies in the fact that this innocent child coming into the world for the first time. Remember, Wordsworth talks about children trailing clouds of glory. It's as if they come to us from some divine place. But this child here, Blake is presenting us with this infant. The first thing he or she hears is its own mother cursing its existence, its own mother sort of flaming its ears with blame, with hate, with a sense of despair. What chance does this child have coming into a world in which its own mother is cursing it? And the language here, I think, moves beyond the deadened, anaesthetised, sort of numb quality that we might have elsewhere. And I think the anger really does explode forth here. Those plosive sounds, blasts, blights, plagues, you almost have to spit them out. And that brings us perhaps to the last line, which is a difficult line. Blights with plagues the marriage hearse. Well, plagues makes us think of illness, disease. The marriage hearse is what we might call an oxymoron, or an unexpected collocation, a placing together of two words you don't expect to see together. The idea of marriage and weddings being linked with the idea of funerals or coffins and death. And perhaps what lies here, we have to think contextually. There were very, very many prostitutes living in London in the late 18th century. and largely being used by the middle class men, the upper class men, and we can imagine these men going back to their families and taking sexually transmitted diseases into their own marriages. And the terrible thing about a disease like syphilis, the STD syphilis, is that it can be passed on to the innocent. And in particular, it can be passed on to the next generations. So children could be born who were already infected with syphilis, who were already infected and condemned, in a world before antibiotics, condemned to an early death, probably condemned perhaps to madness, losing their minds. And the tragedy of existence is encapsulated there, blights with plagues, the marriage hearse. This is a bleak, despairing, horrific view of the urban world in the early years of the Industrial Revolution. And for many people, it's a vision of the urban world which perhaps still holds true.